Professor Martin Schultz. He is coming from Jülich Forschungszentrum, and he is the head of research group Earth System Data Exploration, and also he's a professor at the University of Cologne. He has been active in many different research areas of Earth system data, weather, air quality, climate data, and so on. And he has obtained many awards, such as board member of advisory board of Destination Earth, and he has been named as among highly cited researchers in various different years. We are very excited to have Martin with us today, and I would like to leave the stage to him now. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, welcome everyone, and thanks very much for having me here and giving me the opportunity to discuss the foundations of weather and climate modeling in the age of AI. So in spite of this being a foundation model session, I'm not really going to talk about foundation models much, but rather about what's one step further, what's actually behind all of that. Now let me try to figure out how this works, not with that one. Okay, great. There we go. Okay, so if we look into the history of weather forecasting, this is basically how it started. So in the 17th century or so, or even before, I mean, there are records going back to Roman times or so, where we see these kind of rules that determine weather. I like this one in particular: when ditches and ponds offend the nose, look for rains and stormy blows. And in the meantime, meteorologists have actually analyzed these kind of sayings and found a lot of truth in them. Of course, they're not 100% perfect, and this is already one of the take-home messages I'd like to convey. Weather is never deterministic, but always stochastic. So in that sense, if you have a probability that's better than 50%, you're already on a good side. But this is sort of how it started. Then, towards the end of the 19th century, people started drawing weather maps, all hand-drawn, completely analog, no digitization. But they actually issued daily weather reports and expectations in terms of how the weather will change. Then, and this is basically the ejection from paradise to some extent, numerical weather forecasting started. So the ideas of this date back to the 1920s or so, when people discovered the governing equations of dynamical systems, Navier-Stokes and so on. And then even then people started thinking about that this would be doable to do this numerically. There were these fancy ideas of having a whole stadium with like thousands of people and pens and paper and solving these equations. But it actually only worked out in 1950 with the first successful numerical weather forecast done by Charney, Fjordhoff, and von Neumann. This actually took 24 hours to make a 24-hour forecast, which wasn't due only to the compute time, but as you can read in this paper, primarily because of some system breakdowns and so on. So there were some hurdles in that. But then, since then, this picked up, of course, a lot, and by now we are running operational models at scales of 10 kilometers globally, or even 2 kilometers sometimes. And I guess most of you are very familiar with this kind of weather model and weather model output. The downside of this, and this is sort of what I will come back to a little later, is that it has shaped a lot of the thinking of meteorologists, in the sense that many of us now sort of see weather as fields and gridded data, and this somehow shapes the conception of weather concepts. And I think in the age of AI, we are now in a position that we can overcome this. And I just actually had a very nice conversation with Pierre Gentin at lunch, where we also discussed that that now through these Latin space representations, we have basically a lot more freedom to express our knowledge of weather. And this is, I think, what we are aiming for. Looking a little bit into the climate modeling, a lot of the climate modeling that's being done today follows the very same principles as weather modeling. So you also have these numerical models. You advance them time step by time step. There are lots of limitations in the sense that the finer the resolution of the model is, the shorter your time step has to be, and this really then requires a lot of enormous computational power to solve these model equations. There are also different approaches to climate modeling, and indeed these two papers coming out in 1969 show the first energy balance models, and so this is a much more holistic view on the climate system, where you really just look basically at the energy coming in from the solar irradiation, and then energy transformation processes happening on the Earth, and reflection of the light from clouds and all these kind of things. And through that, you can actually make some very nice predictions about the future changes in the climate system. But we've kind of lost a bit the, let's say, the view on these kind of simple models and these concepts based on the dominance of the numerical models that are now the workhorses of weather and climate science. This is sort of the state of the art now. So we do have models now that run globally at about 1 kilometer resolution. And you can see on the right-hand side what this means. So traditionally, until about 5 years ago, climate models would typically run on like 80 kilometer resolution, and then if you zoom into this region there over the North Atlantic, you see these very blurry squares there, these boxes that somehow indicate cloud fields. And now with a new model, this is even 2 kilometers, not 1, you can see very nicely resolved cloud structures. And indeed, I mean, there are these classical tests at ESA and ECMWF conferences where they put two pictures side by side. One is from the model, one is from the satellite. And I think it's down to very few experts these days to actually tell the two apart. So the realism of these kind of simulations is really, I think, very amazing. But still, I guess it's a big question, do we need that? Do we need this kind of resolution to actually make meaningful and trustworthy weather and climate predictions or projections? This is the one slide on foundation models. So these are results from our WeatherGenerator model that we also use in the HClimRep project. We're quite happy now that we achieved this long, stable rollout. So that's the down-to-earth aspects of science that, I mean, in theory, these things are easy to do and easy to build, but when you actually do it in practice, you get things like latent space freezing and so on, and so it took us some effort to get to this stage that we really can faithfully reproduce these dynamical features and dynamical fields. This works well. We also have all kinds of evaluation scores, and we are really on par with the state-of-the-art weather models and also other state-of-the-art weather AI models. Now let's look into again how this is done traditionally. We have these equations that describe the conservation of momentum, energy, air mass, water vapor mass, and then if you look into chemistry, also the equation of state, the ideal gas law. And then these equations, in order to solve them, we have to discretize them both in space and time. So the space discretization is typically this grid structure that covers the Earth. I mean, this one is a regular grid. Nowadays, people use much more sophisticated grid structures that don't have this kind of pole problem where boxes converge, and this makes simulations more stable and also better, in particular then, of course, for the polar areas. But this discretization really, I think, is one of the bottlenecks in our understanding of the Earth system. And that's why in classical modeling, you need to go down to finer and finer scales in order to get better. One of the interesting revelations from the AI weather models was that the coarse resolution models actually were better in terms of long-term predictions than finer resolution models. So when you had a roughly 1 degree model, which is about 100 kilometer resolution, very coarse from a numerical perspective, people were actually able to show that you can make forecasts up to 23 days, something that's been deemed as almost impossible with classical numerical modeling. When people built these kind of models in finer resolution as an AI model, typically the forecast quality would degrade faster. And so this is one of those puzzles where you start thinking about, okay, what's actually happening in the atmosphere? And where we now come to this conclusion that indeed the long-term evolution of the atmosphere is governed much more by the large-scale features whereas the butterflies are really something that diminishes in very short time. And so, in other words, butterflies cancel out most likely. And so it's sufficient, and this is then one idea that people are now pursuing, that you can actually chain different forecast tools together. So you can run a coarse resolution forecast, also use data assimilation, and then this is from a recent paper that we just submitted. Do, for example, with GraphCast, a 24-hour forecast, at a relatively coarse resolution, and then you apply a separate model, in this case a diffusion model, to do the downscaling to reproduce or generate the high resolution features again. And this works very well. In particular, through that kind of setup, we are able to capture extreme values very nicely. So in that paper, we've done a case study for the Ahrtal flooding that happened in Germany in 2021. And we are able to at least get to like 95% of the maximum rain intensity, which is pretty good compared to other systems. One aspect that we think is relatively new is also that we are not just looking at the spatial downscaling with this, but also at temporal downscaling. So basically in the same setup, we are also interpolating in time, so that we can basically, in the coarse resolution simulation, a 6-hour time step is sufficient. And then for the downscaling, we can break that down into hourly. Potentially, we could even go down to minute resolution data. One other aspect, and this has been discussed already in the Pangu weather paper in 2022, that I think is behind the power of AI weather models, is this ability that you're not dependent on fixed numerical time steps, like in the classical modeling, but you can basically decide what is your target time step for the future. And in Pangu Weather, what they've done is they built 4 different variants of the model with time steps of 1 hour, 3 hours, 6 hours, and 24 hours. And then you can basically couple those together in order to reach any time step that you want. There are some discontinuities in this chaining these things together, but in general, what you can see on the right-hand side is that the error growth over time is obviously a lot smaller when you have longer time steps than when you have small time steps. And again, this is one of the things that you can't do with classical numerical models because of this criterion that dictates basically the maximum length of a time step depending on your grid box size. I lied. This is actually the second slide about the foundation model. So this is the setup of this WeatherGenerator model that we also use in HClimRep, and that's the multi-modality aspect of these models, which actually allow you to also transition or translate one data modality to another. So you can feed in, for example, some weather or climate model input, and then as an output, you can produce a data set that looks like the synoptic station observations or like a satellite observation, and conversely as well. So you can feed in satellite data and then produce a field that looks like it was coming from a numerical reanalysis. And all of that is basically achieved through some, let's say, sophisticated encoder architecture. But then the key thing is indeed, and that's, I guess, what Pierre has presented in his presentation, is this rich latent space representation that really compresses and condenses all this information. And this is really the secret, basically, of the machine learning modeling to understand and control, basically, what this latent space does and what it's about. One of the limitations that are still existent in our AI weather and climate models is indeed the grid representation. So that's primarily based on the fact that, at least originally, pretty much all of these models have been trained on one specific data set, the ERA5 reanalysis from the European Center for Medium-Range Weather Forecast. And this is a gridded data set, which is of course very easy to use. You have no missing values, you have complete coverage of the Earth, you have all the different variables that you need. And so that's of course an ideal target or ideal training data set for a machine learning model, and that's how everyone started. However, in reality, we have a lot of other data sources, and they are naturally not on a grid structure. And so what you do then, if you want to include these kind of data sources into a model, you still force the data onto this grid structure, which is not an optimal representation. And just to give you two examples here, so on the left-hand side, this chaos of curves here is basically just an illustration of the so-called averaging kernels of satellites for temperature retrievals. And what it basically means is that any output from the satellite product in reality covers a broad altitude range. So it's not something that's for example, 920 hectopascal, but this may be the peak of the information, but then there's a lot of information content around that altitude as well. Conversely, if you look into, for example, LiDAR data, you see also that there are different wavelength LiDARs that are somehow then pasted together in order to derive temperature profiles, but you see a lot of very highly structured and high resolution data, which again has to be currently condensed into this vertical grid structure. And so here, this is clearly one opportunity for machine learning models. I haven't seen a model yet that does this, but I'm sure this is around the corner, that we can overcome these kind of rigid grid structures and deal with either more flexible grids or even abandon grid structures completely and incorporate this kind of data natively into the latent space. And indeed, I mean, I've basically just yesterday, out of curiosity, used Gemini to talk a little bit, chat a little bit with it about this problem. And it came up with a solution how we can do that, and said we could use heterogeneous based temporal graph neural networks paired with continuous neural fields. Sounds amazing, doesn't it? If you scrutinize this idea a little more, you will find out that this would be computationally intractable. And there are some other dangers behind this. But, I mean, and that's, I guess, another outcome or discovery with the current, in particular, also agents that are going on there. You can basically engage in a dialogue and take this further. So I've then asked Gemini, okay, let's now assume we would have a proposal to some panel consisting of expert meteorologists and expert AI people. What would they criticize from this approach? And these were three main points that it came up with. And then, of course, the next iteration was, okay, how can we solve this? And then it came up with this idea to apply yet another couple of methods to sort of make it tractable and address these main concerns of the expert reviewers. And of course, the expectation is that one day, and maybe this is closer to the future than we think, we can just basically interact with agents this way, and then the next step would be, okay, now build me this model, and then we would have it and run it. And this, of course, is a tremendous change. To wrap up, I'd like to come to one other aspect, and that's about the climate system, where we still face a lot of other challenges. And here, in particular, the main challenge is the interactions of different Earth system compartments on a very wide range of different timescales. And this is something that's not really captured in the current architectures and ways that we have available from deep learning. But even there are some concepts that exist. And again, I asked Gemini for a solution, and it came up with something that I've also been thinking about, and that's the use of state space models. And it even produced me this very nice figure here to explain what is meant, so that we have like a base network running there on the top for the coarse resolution weather, and then also the temporally high resolved weather, and then we have a set of state space models to capture these different things like a carbon cycle, hydrology, and so on. Other aspects that we can think of for the future would be really to go down to meter scale and couple the kind of weather climate model systems with, for example, the very high resolution Earth observation data. This, of course, is a huge challenge. Also include the human dimension. This has been a big problem in climate science all along. We can think about actors, even gamification and things like that. And then finally, interactive prediction and projection systems. And I'd like to end with this little, with this graphic here from a church in Switzerland showing the, what's it called again, Jüngstes Gericht. So I think we are now at the verge of deciding whether we go to heaven or hell with this, with what's going on. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you for the really nice talk. Do we have questions from the audience? Yes, here in front.
Thanks. Very interesting. Many different components that were very interesting. I'm curious about uncertainty quantification. You know, when we think about especially multi-modality, or when you were showing the foundation aspect model for WeatherGenerator. So I think we used to have like proper ways of dealing with that. You know, with data assimilation. So how would you account for that now, somehow?
It's actually a very tough question. I mean, I was expecting that from you, in the sense that a lot of the metrics that we currently employ are indeed very much based on this grid-based representation that we have in the current weather and climate models. And so many of the skill scores and things that we develop follow this approach. I mean, it's still an active field in meteorology also, for example, with rainfall to look at object type ways of quantifying rainfall patterns. So I think there's still a lot to be done and learned here. But I think the key message is that we need to overcome this sort of the classical boundaries and the classical barriers that we're currently confined with.
Thanks so much.
Yes, a quick question maybe. Yeah.
So exactly about these grid problems, could you, like, I'm sure that I'm not the only one thinking of this, but could you use transformers and then just adapt the positional encoding to the modality that you have without having to recalculate the grids? Is that something that's being done or considered?
It hasn't been done yet, I would say. It may be possible, but on the other hand, I think I guess one of the things that you want to do is you still want to be able to extract things at a given like altitude, for example. And so I think we have to think a bit more carefully about this. And I guess the idea why Gemini presented these neural fields is that there you can basically prompt them at any location you want. And so that gives you more flexibility.
Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Then I would like to thank Martin again for the talk.